I want all of you to take a moment and look back at this slide and tell me if you see a blue slide. Raise your hands if you think it's blue. Okay, that's a majority of you. Now raise your hand if you think that's green. Okay, like 2-3 people. All right. So most of you thought that the slide was blue, and yes, it definitely was blue. But I want you to think about how you would have reacted to everyone in the audience saying that it was green, or from me telling you that that slide was definitely green. Now, we could have two possibilities here. I could tell you that this slide was green because A, I just want to mess with your heads, or B, maybe because I genuinely do believe deep down inside that that slide was green as opposed to being blue. Then, as opposed to being a question of facts, that would become a question of perceptions. Now, it's easy for me to pull up a color wheel and tell you that that slide is blue because I could compare it to a color wheel. But the moment I tell you that this is my opinion and perceptively I believe that that could be green, then no one gets to question me because perception itself is subjective. Perception is a social skill, and you have to be a good listener if you really want to be perceptive, right? So, for instance, if you assume, in taking a statistical note that around 400 million people around the world are native English speakers. So that leaves us with about 1.5 billion remaining, and that 1.5 billion are people who speak English as their second language or as their foreign language. Now, this population of English speakers might not necessarily have that general American accent or a modern RP accent, but they still can communicate in English decently, and that's what matters. Now, I'm going to draw a parallel between the universal language of humans and computers. So this is going to be like English in binary, so ABC equal to 0, 1, 0, if it makes sense. All right, we're going to take a small tangent now. Into the building blocks of artificial intelligence. Not ChatGPT, please, but we're going to look at what created ChatGPT program code. So you've two different types of programs on screen here. One was created using C and the other in Python. It's really basic. Both of them do the very exact same thing. They provide an output called hello world. When I run the two programs, when I run the two programs, you get this output called hello world. But you'll notice a very significant difference. That's what I did in Python in a single line was done in C in 5 different lines. So one was easily more efficient than the other, right? That's possible because Python is a very high-level programming language, while C is a lower-level programming language. All right. Now, the next slide has 2 different Python programs. Now, both of them do the exact same thing. It's quite a bit complicated. It's a piece of object-oriented programming code. But on one end, you have those tiny hashtags. Those are called comments. But on the other end, you don't really have that. So this code is a bit more descriptive, while this code is not descriptive. But at the end of the day, once again, they do the same thing. They are declaring something called a constructor. So while the end goal is similar, there were 2 different ways of writing it. That's all I want you to take from this. So even within the same programming language, I could have multiple ways of expressing my code. So at the end of the day, it's the duty of any programmer who reviews my code to be able to think of what the logic behind that would be. So even intellectual programmers submitted this piece of code without any programming conventions, no descriptive variable names or no proper comments, then it would be up to the hierarchy who reviews it to extract the logic out of it. And maybe someday, if they thought that was a really good program, make that into a wonderful application or whatnot. Now, that is synonymous to how we socialize with English as a universal language in our social circles. And I'll tell you how. We built computers because we wanted them to perform better. We wanted them to improve our efficiency. Now, notice that computers are changing. They're changing because their creators are changing. We are changing, and we're making them change. But the demands that we've set for our evolving world only materialize because there's some scope left for those demands. So, in this instance, I'm going to associate English to be equal to binary, that's machine code, 101, that computers kind of thrive on. So, to make life easier for programmers, what we did was create things like Python, create things like C, so that people could easily access machine code, so that they could manipulate machine code, because it was too hard for programmers to code in either binary or ASCII. That was the purpose of writing, or that was the purpose of having other code to access it, right? Having code that you could use to manipulate a computer or do whatever you want to do with it. But realize that there is a problem here. In his theory of evolution, Charles Darwin told us that the good in Homo sapiens was just as adaptive as the bad. Now, the progress that we are making with technology is extremely ironic. Why? Because while we're still making massive technological breakthroughs every single day, every single minute, we're turning a blind eye to the social progress that we could be making within our own communities. We are actively choosing to not translate all of the information that we've heard in non-standardized English into an appropriate way in our heads, and that's problematic because we miss out on several ideas, astonishing opinions, just because we think someone else's English sounds bad, or just because we think they don't sound up to normal standards. Now, if English was an alternative to binary, then obviously the other variations we have, like Python and C, are going to be different accents of English. It could be a Japanese accent of English or an Indian accent of English, because different people with different native languages would obviously interpret English in a different way. And that's synonymous to what we do with program code. But at the end of the day, note that we do this. We do this because we want to have something else to access the core of it. We want, because it's not as easy to speak English fluently, and because it's obviously not as easy to just code in ASCII out of the blue moon. So we want to have another step to go on to before we go into the core of what we want to learn. Then remember that if at all, from everything we've considered in our society today, from brain cells to binary to software to DNA, being able to process the same input in multiple ways is very important. Take that as a skill that humans need to have. If that counts as a skill, then one of our biggest flaws would probably be us not being able to listen to speech that was presented in the same language, but maybe in a slightly different manner. Maybe words were pronounced differently. Maybe the way certain sentences were structured weren't completely accurate. But that doesn't give us room to completely disregard the content of what was said. So the point I'm trying to tell you here is very simple. If you can easily use another language that's easier for you to code a program to tell a computer what to do, then it's completely all right for someone to tell you what they want to tell you in broken English. They don't have to use standardized English. It's time we started recognizing different accents that actually exist across the world instead of trying to reduce them. Let's appreciate them and actually respect their diversity, because the number of people in society who are scared of talking or who are scared of putting their voices out because they think the way they speak English sounds bad is really high. And that happens when their listeners aren't willing to take in the content that they're saying. So at the end of the day, it boils down to us, the people who listen to all of these people who talk in, well, whatever type of non-standardized English they use. Only 11.6% of the Fortune 500 CEOs were born outside of the US. And an even smaller percentage of these leaders actually speak English as an additional language. So if only 400 million people in our entire world speak what's considered to be the normal standard of English, then they would inherently become a minority to the 1.5 billion people who don't speak English as a native language and who possibly speak different forms of English and have English manipulated in a different way because their accents simply differ. People are really scared of being judged. They're scared of being misunderstood. They're scared of being labeled as that part of society that can't speak perfect English. That holds them back. It keeps their voices locked. Now, the bulk of YouTube's base code was actually written in Python, and I'm pretty sure lots of you know this. The second largest video sharing platform in the entire world was coded in a variation of binary or ASCII. So rather, they used a shortcut to manipulate a very complicated machine code that they easily couldn't. Arguably, like I already told you, Python gets easier than C, C easier than ASCII, and ASCII way easier than trying to code in binary, which is nearly impossible. Now, I would argue that the bandwidth of information you obtain from watching every single YouTube video would be equal to the number of ideas that were possibly held back from being uploaded onto YouTube or from even being communicated in any external platform because people had barriers to communication, because people had barriers to speaking English, because they were afraid of being judged, of putting themselves out in society. If Python is a programmer's shortcut to manipulate code, then non-standardized English could be anyone's shortcut to access global communication, because we view English as a universal language, and that is an important metric to set. If being able to code in any programming language is necessary, then we could easily argue that understanding the variations of a universal language like English would easily become as important. Because remember, learning English so fluently could be as hard as trying to learn to code in ASCII or binary for any programmer, and that is a clear point that we have to set. So maybe it's time for all of us to stop expecting perfect English and start accepting people for the effort that they put in to understand and speak the language that they can, speak English to the best of their abilities. To all of those of you who felt insecure about the way you speak, I want you to know that it's completely all right. The way you speak English doesn't matter, because it's about whether or not you can access that global universal language. If your listener can't make sense of what you're saying, then they're the ones missing out, because learning to be perceptive in any language is also a social skill that humans have to possess. In the words of Shehan Karunatilaka, make what all the world's millionaires do not. What's that? Enough. I'm here to tell you that bad English is good enough. If someone's green is your blue, then all you have to do is understand their version of green and accept it. And that is how you justify calling a perfectly blue slide green. Thank you.